black thing go from left to right, and I thought, I'm going to die out here. No one's ever going to know. I couldn't believe what my eyeballs were showing me. I'll never forget how evil the eyes were. It was horrible. I mean, I've never seen nothing that evil.
It ran towards me at a rate that I can't even explain. Turned and stared at me, and this look of, I just want to kill you. I want to say it was human, but it wasn't.
He was yelling at me to grab a gun. I was like, for what? He said, just grab a gun. And there's footprints all the way to the door of my house. It had went inside my garage, all the way to the door.
911, what are you reporting?
Jesus Christ, you better...
Sir?
See ya!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh.
You're listening to Sasquatch Chronicles. Check us out online at sasquatchchronicles.com. If you've had an encounter, email me. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. Welcome to the show, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. Got a great show planned for you tonight. We'll be talking to Dylan, and Dylan comes to us from Washington State. He was actually out with his dad. They were out doing a hiking trip, and one of these things came up. They were in their hammocks and stood over the top of them while they were sleeping. And then we'll go to Joe, and Joe actually had a pretty terrifying encounter with one of these things on this hunting property. A lot of weird things have been happening on this property, and it wasn't until he got a good look at one. It stepped out from behind a tree, and he's pointing his bow at it. It's a very, very fascinating account. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. And if you get a chance, check out sasquatchchronicles.com. You can become a member and get additional shows. And to remind everyone, I will be in Houston on actually May 8th. I fly in May 8th. I know we're doing the live show on the 11th, and then I think we're going to drive up to Dallas, and thinking about doing a meet and greet. It'll probably be me, Tony Merkel, and Bob Gimlin, and I hope to see you guys out there. Let's jump into it tonight. I want to welcome Dylan to the show. Dylan, thanks for coming on.
Hey, Wes, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate being here. I'm really interested to hear this encounter that took place in Washington State. Kind of take us to that moment. What were you doing, and what happened?
Yeah, so this experience really happened in June of 2014 in Lena Lake, which is an area in the Olympic National Park. So this was mostly kind of at the beginning of the camping season, and it was right after I had just graduated from high school. So a little bit before I get into the whole story here, just thought I'd share some background on myself. I've always been an avid outdoorsman and fisherman. In fact, my senior project involved me becoming a certified member of my county search and rescue team. And so I had been on several searches for missing persons. I was an avid backcountry hiker. Also been able to be pretty good with identifying wild game. And I've probably seen black bears more times than I could count. I even remember when I was a kid, my parents having to call Fish and Game to get one out of our backyard that got stuck. But we decided to take this trip, me and my dad, for a few days after my dad's friend recommended that we go here to try and climb the Brothers Peak. And the Brothers Peak, it's not really a hardcore climb at all. It's just a really difficult hike, really. But he did say that we needed to watch out for some wildlife, which is pretty obvious, and of course keep our food away from us at night. Now at the time, I never really believed in Bigfoot. I just thought it was culmination of a bad drug trip, really, because it sounded so ridiculous to me.
Yeah, I get it.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, and my real concern was bears, just because it can turn into a hairy situation if you spook one. But so we took off for this trip, and it's important to know, I mean, this is a really steep hike just to get to the lake. So while it's definitely a popular place to go, it's not very trafficked. There's not a whole lot of people that are able to get up there. So we decided to spend 3 days there at first and hike the Brothers Peak on the second day. And the first day, we decided to just get up there and make camp. And we sort of picked a place that seemed mostly secluded, just because we didn't want anybody bothering us. We were just hanging out. And we made sure, like I said, we kept all of our food 50 yards away from us as soon as we were done eating. And we tied it up to a tree just because we didn't want to worry about anything coming up on us while we were trying to sleep. And that night, we noticed that there was only 3 other people that we saw up at the lake. And all 3 of those groups, I guess, immediately left as soon as they started seeing some rain. My dad and I just had to tie up some tarps around our hammocks, but I'm pretty sure just everybody else wasn't prepared for the weather. So we went to bed, and everything seemed just fine for the most part, really. It was probably around 2 a.m. that I randomly woke up, and I am an extremely heavy sleeper, and if something wakes me up, it means that there's something wrong. And I immediately started smelling this horrible smell. I mean, absolutely putrid. And I know that black bears and stuff can smell, but they don't smell this bad. And I remember just kind of looking around, and then I heard something moving right next to my hammock. It was probably maybe a foot or 2 above me from what I could tell, just being under a tarp and everything. But the only thing going through my mind was, oh my God, there's a bear right next to me, and I am in possibly the worst position to be in to deal with a bear right now, given that I'm literally stuck in this hammock. So I grabbed my knife that was just laying right next to me, and I just stayed quiet, wondering why the crap would a bear want to come so close to humans when they can smell us from so far away, and we didn't have any food near us. But I did look over at the gap in my dad's hammock. I could see him. He was wide awake, and he was just looking at me with that do not move look. And so me being 18 and kind of angsty, I really wasn't about to become a meal or get attacked by something without really even knowing what it was. So I kind of cranked my head around, and I was able to glance underneath the gap in my tarp. And what I saw was something that's baffled me to this day, and something I cannot rationalize in my own head, because I was just so sure that we were dealing with a bear. And the first thing I noticed was that this thing was standing. And I mean, bears can do that, sure, but they don't have arms that can lean up against one base of a tree, and the other arm was almost touching the ground. And my next reaction was to try and look for its head. I mean, just to look for a nose or something, and I couldn't find its snout. And that was when I started realizing that I wasn't dealing with a bear. And I mean, it was dark. I could make out his shape, and I could make out the hair for the most part. His face was, as far as I could tell, pretty flat. But I started just trying to look around and figure out what he was looking at, because he was staring at my dad's tarp. And I don't know if I moved or what it was, but it finally just whipped around, and it stared directly at me. And to me, it felt like an hour, but it was probably only 5 minutes or so of us just staring at each other. And he kind of straightened himself up, and he looked at me, and I say I don't really know. And probably maybe 5 minutes go by, and this thing just lets out a low-pitched breath, and it just takes off. And the rate that it took off at is just astounding, given that there's fallen trees all over the place. Forest Service hasn't come out and cleaned any of this stuff yet. It's still too early in the season, and it was just gone, and it was almost without a sound, and that's what really shocked me for the most part. And at that point, whatever this was, it was already gone. I was too stunned, really, to even want to get out of my hammock, and so I just went to bed at this point, hoping that nothing was going to come back. So that was the first interaction with whatever this thing was. To this day, I'm still convinced it's not a black bear, for sure. But so the second day, I woke up, my dad was looking around, and I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "You didn't see that black bear last night?" And I looked at him, I was like, that wasn't a bear. And he was like, "What are you talking about? Of course it was a bear. Did you smell it?" And I said, "Yeah." And he's like, "No, there's a bear around here. I'm trying to figure out if I can find its tracks." And I said, "Okay." And at that point, I knew he really didn't see this thing, and I didn't want to say anything just because my dad's the type of person that's not really going to believe in what he would consider nonsense, really. So, and I understand it. But anyways, we just decided to let the whole thing go, and we went on our hike to get to the Brothers Peak. And we had been probably hiking, for about 2 miles. And we were hiking along this riverbed. And as we were hiking, I began to kind of start to get this weird feeling, that feeling with the hairs kind of climbing up on the back of your neck. And everything started getting really, really quiet. And the entire time up to this point, you could hear birds chirping. There were squirrels running around everywhere. And for about 5 minutes, everything was dead silent. And then my dad, who was probably about 20 feet ahead of me, just stopped dead in his tracks. And me not really understanding why he was stopping, I kept walking until he grabbed me and by my pack and just made me stand still. And then I realized the smell was back. And I started whipping my head back and forth, trying to figure out what it was, trying to figure out what was near us. And my dad just looked at me and he whispered, "I think that a bear is following us." And to me, that just sounded ridiculous because bears don't follow people around. It's just unreasonable to assume that, especially black bears. They don't really want to be around humans for the most part. But it was that gross BO skunk smell that really set me off and started to make me a lot more nervous than I was the night before when I was more shocked than anything. So at that point, we realized that there was really no way for us to get to the brothers without spooking whatever it was in the woods. So we ended up just turning around and we hiked all the way back to our original campsite. And at that point, given our experience the night before and that we hadn't ran into anybody else during our hike, we decided that it might be best to just pack our stuff up and head home a day early, just because we really weren't prepared to have to deal with bears or whatever was in the woods at that point. So,
yeah, it's terrifying, man. And bears have more of a musky smell. Wouldn't you agree with that, Dylan? I mean,
yeah,
they don't
absolutely
smell like skunks. It stinks, but it doesn't stink like what you're describing.
Even when they're going through mating season, they'll tend to smell a little bit more, but it's more of a musky smell. It's not this putrid odor that was hitting us. I had to hold my breath when I was in my hammock because the smell was just too much for me to handle.
Yeah, and it's like I was telling you, if you talk to a lot of old-timers, especially miners, they'll tell you all sorts of stories. They'll call them campsite robbers. And I think I was telling you about an encounter where a guy was sleeping in a hammock. I want to say it was Washington State. And he woke up, and basically there was what he describes as two great apes. One was standing over the top of him, looking at him in the hammock, and the other one was going through his pack and like taking stuff. And he, in his description it was great apes. But I think it's fascinating. I almost think it was curious. Like, what in the world are you guys doing out here? Did you get that impression, or did you get an impression like it was ready to harm one of you?
No, actually, I mean, exactly what you said. I have to assume that it was curious. I mean, I was holding my knife, and when it turned around, I immediately just dropped it because I realized that, I mean, there was just no use. But the fact that it just stood there and was staring at me, and it was really just sniffing us. There was these weird low-pitched breathing noises. I can't really describe it, and I can't really do it myself to have it make any sense to you. But yeah, and I'm not sure if there were others around. I do know that there was this one, and then he cocked his head over to a different direction, and that's when he took off. But I have to assume that it was just out of curiosity, because I really didn't feel too threatened. And I didn't feel threatened until we got to that point in our hike. At that point, I started getting pretty nervous.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I've heard them breathe, and the best description I came up with, I don't know if it's a great description or not, but the best description I came up with was like a sick bear. That's kind of how they breathe, like a sick bear. That real raspy in and out,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's pretty much how I would peg it for the most part.
Do you still go out there? Do you still do hikes? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, we've gone all over the place since then. I head over to Bumping Lake every once in a while. I know that you had mentioned some reports about over there. I've never had any issues personally, but me and some buddies are going to head back up to Lena Lake again this year. I think that having 5 of us might be a little bit better, and we're probably going to try and go a little bit later in the summer. I've got a few other friends that are huge Bigfoot fanatics, and they've asked us to come with them to go Bigfoot hunting and all this other stuff. And while I go just to amuse them and stuff, the only thing in my mind is, why would anybody want to actively coax one out towards them? Because it just doesn't seem reasonable to me. But at the same time, I went on these hikes because I just feel like there's no way that a person is really going to be able to coax one out. If they're going to come out and see you and show themselves, they're doing it on their own intent.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. I get what you're saying, and I understand why people want to go out and look, but it does feel like a little bit like you're going out to coax a grizzly bear to come in.
Exactly.
Which may not turn out for the best for you. I want to ask you, how big do you think it was when it was standing over the top of you guys?
My dad and I are about 6'4", and this thing had at least a foot on us. And I mean, that's the best estimate I can give. So probably just over 7 feet tall. But the arm span on this thing was just absolutely out of this world. It was kind of leaning up against the base of this tree and above its head, and its other arm was literally, like I said, it was almost touching the ground, that was when I immediately realized, we're not dealing with a bear here. I don't know what this thing is.
Yeah, and a bear isn't going to be that curious either. They're not going to come in.
No.
They don't have arms that go down to the ground too either, but they're not going to come in and screw with you guys like that, especially with the way you guys are keeping your food up and everything.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've had bears come around campsites and stuff, but they don't go anywhere near people. They go straight for the garbage. So that's why I was just so confused as to why this thing was circling around us. We didn't have any food. So.
Yeah, and it may not have been interested in that. I want to ask you, what do you think Sasquatch is, Dylan? I mean, I'm sure you've kind of looked into this now. Obviously, it wasn't a bear.
I've actually been taking, back in school, I recently took a Native American Studies class just to gain some insight on Native American culture. My girlfriend's a part of one of the Puget Sound tribes. Anyways, one of my projects was to cover these oral traditions of origin, which are basically their origin stories from the Puget Salish region in Washington. And these stories date back 10,000 years ago, kind of around towards the end of the Ice Age, when they say that the world was in flux. So these Native Americans had migrated into Washington at that time. And a lot of these stories that I've heard involve characters like the Bear Men and the Sky People and the Dog Salmon Men, or Dog Salmon People, several other characters. And a lot of these characters are portrayed as these terrible people that were eventually chased off. And I have to believe that there's some sort of truth to that, and that these things are just descendants, I guess, of these first peoples who were forced basically into isolation. And over the past 10,000 years or so, I mean, they have to have developed and evolved differently than us.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially when you look into the Native Americans, and we have a rich history of that. I know you mentioned your girlfriend's part of the Puget Sound, but even like the Chehalis tribe, I've gone to ceremonies where you watch these dances, and it's a wild woman of the woods, and she steals children, eats them. And if you really go through and you're like, what in the world is going on here? And, basically they're talking about Sasquatch. So they do have a long history of it. You have to be safe when you're out there. Let me know if you decide to go out there again. Let me know if anything happens, will you?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely will. I think we're planning a trip for mid part of July. So I'll hit you up if we hear anything out there.
Perfect. And I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Wes. It's been a great experience.
Well, next up, I want to welcome Joe to the show. Joe, thanks for coming on.
Hey, how you doing, Wes?
I'm doing well, man. I'm doing well. I can't wait to hear this full encounter, and I know it happened in Ohio. And if you would just kind of start from the beginning, Joe, tell us what you're doing and walk us into what happened, if you would.
Okay. We're big hunters. We had gained access to a new lease about 4 or 5 years ago. And the first year went by, pretty normal. Nothing happened. And then, in year 2, right at the very beginning of the season always starts the last weekend in September. I was in my stand, second day, and it started out with, it sounded like somebody was talking. And it was like far off, you just couldn't make it out, but it was definitely like something back and forth. And, I kind of brushed it off. I didn't think about it. There's not a lot of people that live around down there, but there's a few, and there's some other hunters on neighboring properties. So I just kind of brushed it off and figured it out, or, figured it was nothing. So a few days later, my brother and I, we went hunting again, and I heard the same thing. And I was beginning, to kind of wonder, it's like, this is really weird. And I knew it was in an area that he had heard it too. So when I came out of the woods that evening, I was going to ask him, what he did or heard. And he met me at the truck, and the first thing he said to me was, "Did you hear those people talking?" And so, not wanting to tip my hand, really, I said, "I thought I did, but I couldn't make it out. Could you?" And he said, "Yeah, same thing here." And he's like, "They got kind of close, and it was like they were talking gibberish." And I was like, "Well, was it one person, two person?" Well, he's like, "It was definitely, there was two things, two people talking." He's like, and I couldn't make out what they were saying. So that ride home, we kind of spent talking about what we both had heard. And so, like I said, we both hunt pretty often. And a few weeks later, we had both been to the woods multiple times, and each had heard a few more, odd things. We had a few more talking episodes, a whoop, some rock clackings, just a few weird things, but nothing that was definitively anything. It all could possibly be explained away, essentially. So about another morning, about 3 weeks after the initial incidents, I had a work commitment and couldn't join him in the woods. He was going to go hunting early in the morning. So about 6 in the morning, I get a call from my brother. I knew he was going, so hoping nothing went wrong, I answered the phone, and he was immediately sounded upset. After a few minutes, calming him down, I finally got it out of him that something had screamed at him as he was almost to his stand. So, I was telling you before, my brother, he's a pretty tough guy. He was my bigger brother, the protector, big and tough, and I had never heard him sound as scared as he was in that call. He told me it was like nothing he had ever heard before. It sounded like it was, wanting to tear him apart, he said. And he just was freaking out. And he said there was like a grunting and a growling together, after the scream, that he could essentially feel it shaking in his chest. He wanted to run, he wanted to hide, he didn't know what he wanted to do. It freaked out. It was pitch black, no light. So he decided, make the last little bit to his stand and got up in his stand and just was waiting for the sun. So, he called me and he's like, I'm not letting you off the phone. Stay on the phone with me. Stay on the phone. So, I stayed on and, it was about a half hour. And then, I'm trying to tell him, listen for stuff. And finally, the sun was coming up and he said he shushed me. He's like, I hear something. I hear something. And then he said all of a sudden it was like a freight train had exploded through the woods about 75, 100 yards and was heading away from him. He never saw anything. He said, but it was, it was crazy. So once he finally couldn't hear anything, he hightailed it out of there. So a few days later, after kind of, the shock of it all wore away, we went back out to our land and tried to find some signs of it. And other than a few broken branches, there really wasn't much, to see. And, my brother, who, I credit for even going back out there, wasn't wanting to really stay very long. So we got his stand down and left the area. We kind of decided, we'll leave that part of the lease. We'll just hunt the other side. It's a pretty good sized property. So we figured we could avoid it and just kind of move on. So, a few days go by, we're talking about it and discussing it. And we kind of convinced ourselves that if whatever made those screams wanted to hurt him, it could have done it. It was pitch black. He couldn't see anything. And we just kind of convinced ourselves that, it was just a warning, hey, stay away. And, we at this point are beginning to think maybe this is something, and, but a few weeks go by and we're really big hunters. And the rut in Ohio, usually starts around the end of October into November, and it was getting to be close to that time. And, so back to the woods we went, basically. And, a few hunts later, I was in my stand. It was, first week of October-ish, somewhere in there. And it had been a pretty wet year that year, so a lot of the leaves had stayed on later than normal. And I was in my stand, and it was one of those kind of days when like a strong breeze makes it look like it's, snowing leaves, basically, out in the woods. And I was sitting there, and then I heard it again, the chatter. And it was, out in front of me, and this time it was a little higher pitched than I remembered. So, needless to say, I was on full alert, a little bit nervous. And then I started to hear something sounded like it was, coming towards me. And my stand, just for a little visual reference, it sits on a flat about 30 yards across, and I have valleys that go down on either side of me. My stand is on the left side of that flat. There's a lot of, big oaks and some other brush, stuff like that too. And on my left-hand side, I like to watch the deer come from out in front of me, and there's two natural shelves that run along that hillside. One's about, 20, 30 yards below me, and there's another one about 50, 60 yards. And the 30-yard one I can see always. The one lower, it's a lot harder to see. There's a lot more, brush. I have two shooting lanes that are cut. One about, 45 degrees out into the front of me, and then one, 90 right down below me. And it was coming out in front of me, the noises. And, suddenly it sounded, I don't know, it's weird to say, but it sounded like two monkeys, chit-chatting, you hear in the zoo. It was just weird. And all of a sudden I could as I'm hearing this and it's getting closer, and it sounded like there was two different noises, something on the ground and then it was like there was something in the trees. And I thought at one point I seen the trees like starting to move out in front of me to the left. And all of a sudden there was a breeze that kind of shifted and it came at my back, and it would have been in my face, which it normally is. And when that happened, all of a sudden there was a noise that it was kind of like a grunt and like a huff, like a, and all of a sudden that's a terrible example. Sorry, but
no, it's all right.
all of a sudden the noises stopped. Everything, like the sound on the ground, the trees moving, the noises in the trees, all of it just completely stopped. So I'm sitting there for a few minutes. I'm looking, and everything had gotten, eerily quiet. There was no sound, no nothing, no squirrels moving, no birds chirping, anything. And after, it felt like an eternity, but it was probably, 3 or 4 minutes. A nice, gust of wind came again, and the leaves start falling like that again. And then I heard another noise, and it was like a sound, like kind of louder, like kind of not a whistle, but, like a whoosh, whoosh. And when that happened, I heard some limbs breaking, and it sounded like 2 tree stumps, like falling out of the trees and landing, like 2 distinct, thuds on the ground. And it was followed by 2 things that were clearly running down the hill. And, I've been hunting since I'm 6 years old. I know what deer sound running away, and it didn't sound like deer running through the woods. Deer, they kind of make that bounding noise, through the woods. And this was definitely something running away. And those noises kind of ended pretty quickly. And they were out in front of me, and they kind of went from about 45 degrees out in front of me to my left to about 60 degrees, down the hill. And, that, kind of after the initial shock of that, my attention kind of turned back to what made like the deeper grunts and the, the other noises. And it sounded like it had come from that lower shelf, about 60 yards. That's about below me, but now it's out in front of me. It's probably more than, around 80 to 100 yards away from me. And like I told you in our earlier talks, in Ohio, you're lucky if you're in the middle of the woods and you can see 100 yards. That's just kind of how Ohio woods are. There's a lot of rolling, and lots of undergrowth and thick stuff and brush, and things can just disappear in the woods like that. And so I'm looking for any kind of sound, anything. All of a sudden, I hear like a squirrel coming from my right-hand side, and it's coming across the top of the flat, and it's kind of heading down over towards where I had heard the last noise, and all of a sudden it shot up a tree and started barking its head off. So I'm watching right over there everywhere, and I hunt with a compound bow and a crossbow, and on that hunting trip I had taken my crossbow, and it just dawned on me to pick that up and start looking through the scope. And as I'm doing that, I'm scanning. I'm looking where I think the squirrel's barking, and that's kind of when I saw something when I did see something that kind of changed everything. And it was a hand. It was just a hand, and it was wrapped around like a big oak tree, like holding on. And I'm looking at it, and I'm looking, and I'm, I wasn't really believing it at first, and I look off and blink off the scope and then look back. And, as I look back on it again, it moved. It repositioned the way it was holding. It kind of reached a little bit farther around the tree. And, at first all I could see was just a hand, and as it moved a little farther, I could see a little bit of the arm, like, the wrist area. It was covered in hair. It was really dark skin. So I'm looking on either side of this tree to try and see like what this is attached to. It was a bigger tree, and then I saw it. It was very slowly and methodically, a face began to creep around the tree and was looking directly up at me. It was like, imagine if you're, playing hide and seek, in the woods, and you peek around the tree, to look at somebody, that's what it did. And it was almost a black face, dark hair. And I'm looking down there through my scope on my bow. And as I look, it's looking directly up at me. Now, it's not like searching around the woods to see something. It's looking right up at where I was positioned. And my stand had been in there. That was the second year. I'd left it, over the year. It was a hang-on stand, has a, climbing sticks up to it. So I assumed that something that might live in those woods would know that it was there. And as it looked around, it looked, like I said, right at me. And as I'm looking through the scope, I could literally see its eyes widen, like, oh, what are you doing here? What are you, almost like as if she was surprised. And it pulled its face back and pulled its hand back, and there was no mistaking it. I instantly knew what I had saw, and as we're sitting there, I'm looking, and I didn't see anything. It was behind the tree, and then all of a sudden, all this is interrupted by rock clackings, like someone taking two rocks and banging them together rapidly, like bang, 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 bang. It did it 3 times. And it was followed by like a quick high-pitched whistle. And this was down the hill from where I had heard the things run off before. And when that happened, it was like she made a sound from behind that tree, and it was almost as if she was like shushing them. And I assumed it was little ones. I assumed that she had 2 babies with her because it sounded like two different things running. And, it was amazing. I didn't know what to think. And so, I just kind of instinctively lifted my bow back up, and I'm looking back down. And as I'm looking back down by that tree where she was behind, she, put her head around the tree again. And this time her face wasn't the same. She before had, kind of surprised, kind of just docile look about her. This time she was not happy. And it was clear that she was not happy. She was showing her teeth. Her eyes were, slanted and squeezed tight. And it was, she was not happy that I was there. And I didn't even think about it. Maybe I'm pointing this, what, maybe they know them as weapons or bang sticks or what they think are guns or whatever, and she just was not happy. So every couple of minutes I'm watching, I'm looking, I kind of put the bow down a little, and I knew, she was still there, because if she had moved, at this point I had kind of found her, I kind of had pinpointed her, and if she had went back the way she had come, I think I would have, at least seen something. And then the wind picked up again, and there was more of the leaves falling. And when that happened, she moved from one tree to the next, about 5 yards away. And over the course of the next, 5 or 10 minutes, every time she would do this, she would move from tree to tree. And she got to a point where she would either have to cross my shooting lane that I had cut out, or she'd have to take a route back the other way. And it's kind of odd how this little piece is, she would have had to go off of a weird drop off, and I think I would have heard her fall, not fall, but jump off of that. And so I'm sitting there, and she was at the last tree right before, going out into that shooting lane. And I knew she was there. She was about 7 foot tall, I would say, a little more than, probably 7 to 8 foot. And she had a very big body, but it was somehow kind of like lean. You know what I mean? It was like she was just strong, just big and strong, but not real, like, I guess fat, you know what I mean? For lack of a better way.
Yeah.
of saying it. And I call her because I could see breasts. At one point when she kind of went around, she kind of turned, that body turned towards me, and you could see them. I mean, it was pretty distinct. And she's standing at that last tree before the shooting lane, and as she's just about to step out, I'm lifting my crossbow up to look down there through my scope again. And right as I'm lifting it up, she kind of steps out and looks up at me and stops. and I'm looking at her through the scope, and she turned and faced me. And she had this look on her face. I could see it for a half a second, and it just wasn't happy. And I lowered the bow, and she kind of took like an aggressive stand, not like down on all fours or crouch, but kind of like how like a linebacker lines up, and she just had this aggressive stance, and she kind of began to like growl and show her teeth. And she even took as much as, 3 or 4 steps towards me. So I instantly just put my bow, I hung it up on my hanger, and she just stood there looking at me for, a good 30 seconds, and just would kind of take a step towards me and kind of, growl a little bit. And then she just moved off and went right towards where I had heard the 2 things run. And to the bottom of that hill, it's about, 400 or 500 yards downhill. And when she took off out of that shooting lane, she was kind of running. Not like sprinting, but she was moving quick. And as she was going down, I could hear them, kind of moving through the woods and making some sounds down there. And at the bottom of the hill, I was just about, just about stopped hearing them when I heard a big, like a giant pop and crashing sound. Like, I mean, you've been out in the woods, you've heard trees fall down, and it was like something had broke a large tree. And I included in my email, I don't know if you got it, a picture of, it's a pretty healthy tree, and I'd say it's probably maybe 6 to 10 inches around. My gauge is a little bad on that, but it was broken about 3-4 feet off the ground, just snapped over and broken. And after that, hearing all that, I kind of, I was pretty shaken, needless to say, and I felt pretty unwelcome in my woods. So once I was able to finally get down and get out of the woods, I got down out of my stand, and I just left. And I called my brother on the way home, and, he was at a function with his fiance and didn't get my message, and he went hunting the next morning, and he's the one who actually took the picture of the tree on his way out of the stand. He checked, his voicemail when he was up in his tree finally, and, came back and found the picture, found the tree, took a picture of it, and sent it. And it was a pretty perfectly healthy tree, and there were no storms or anything else that could have done what happened to this tree, if you ask me. And, that's kind of what happened, and my brother and I and our family, we still hunt this land. We both have kids, that hunt. We never let them hunt alone. Over the last few years, we've shot deer, and let them leave overnight to, sit and, come and find a pool of blood and hair everywhere and no deer, and we kind of look at these as, peace offerings, I guess, for them. And, for a long time, you heard the rumors, but, we pretty much know now that this is what's on our property. And there's a Bigfoot and babies with her babies on our property. And, we've, over the last few years, looked and tried to find sign, and, we'll find a footprint, but nothing ever, that's castable. And as soon as it gets into the winter, late fall, early winter, all of our activity goes away. We hear stuff more in early fall, October, like I said, November, stuff like that. But as soon as the winter hits, we lose everything. And I think that's mainly because our woods thin out a little bit, and you can see a lot more. And I don't know if, there's a better place for them. I mean, granted, we only have, 250 acres, so there's a lot of land around there that they can go to.
Let me ask you, Joe, when you were looking at this thing, can you describe the face, and would you say, in your estimation, it was more human-like, or would you say it was more like a non-human primate?
I would say it was a pretty good mix of both, to be honest. It had the flat nose. It didn't really have a cone head. It didn't have the conical shape as much on the top that a lot of people see, and but it was very, very distinct features. Big cheekbones and a flat nose, and when it growled and it showed its teeth at me, they weren't pretty white teeth. They were yellow, ugly teeth, and they were real big. No fangs. I couldn't see like fangs or anything like that. I don't know if I'm sure you've seen the Todd Standing stuff, his documentary. The final picture of that, the one that's hiding that he shows in his documentary, it looked a lot like that. It was, it wasn't the face of a monkey. It wasn't the face of a gorilla, but it wasn't the face of a human. It was almost like the perfect mesh of both, to be honest.
Yeah, I'd be real careful on that property, man, with her out there, because you don't know what, and it's amazing to me. A lot of times when I hear guys in tree stands, it's very similar. And as you and I were talking earlier, I was telling you, I think that it throws them off when you're up in a tree, because I think they're used to seeing people stumble through the woods, and it's just different when you see someone up in a tree. And a lot of guys that, bow, I know you guys in Ohio, you were telling me that you guys can only hunt like 1 week with guns, and then the rest is with, the bow and arrow. But with a lot of times when they look up at people in tree stands, I've heard a lot of hunters tell me that, where it was confusion, almost like, what in the world are you doing up there? And, that could have gone south pretty quick.
Right. I agree. She, like I said, and the way you put it is perfect. How when she peeked her face around that around that tree the first time, she looked right at me and her eyes kind of widened, like, whoa, what are you doing here? What are you doing up up there? And it was almost like I surprised her, and like the way you said it is perfect. She just was shocked that I was there, and that shock, it went from like a surprised, shocked face to, a lack of a better term, a pissed off face. Like, instead of why are you here, it's why are you here, and she was not happy, and she showed her teeth, and like I said, she had the slitted eye, like, like an angry look you give someone. You're ready to fight them. And that was the face that she had. And
yeah, and it might have been from pointing the bow at her. I've heard from, I've had homeowners, and I was talking about this on the last show, how, I've had people who pull out mag lights, and they'll point them at these things, and it pisses them off. Not really sure why it pisses them off, but it pisses them off when you do that. So it might have been, she might have thought you were hunting, she was going to be next or whatever. It kind of sounds like they've probably seen you and your brother a lot. If you guys are killing deer, you go to find them and they're gone. And then with your brother's experience, they've probably been watching you guys for a while.
I imagine from the first time we, scouted out this lease, that they knew we were there, and they've always known we were there. And I don't know if, I have no reference from before we were there, but, I think that's when the woods thin out in the winter, as all the, leaves fall and the foliage dies off, we don't see or hear them as much because they're more visible. They could be more visible to us. And I think they understand that and know that, and they stay away, and they know the areas that we hunt. We have, stands that we put up, and we leave them year round. So I think they know when to go around them, when they can be close to us, when we, shoot deer in the beginning of the season. And, as it gets later in the year, they don't come around those stands anyway. And it's kind of a shaky feeling, he's got, 3 kids that hunt. I have a daughter, she's 11, his daughter and 2 boys are, 12, 14, and 15, so it's a little intimidating to go out in the woods and know that something that big is out there with us. But, I think we've kind of, when we hear them, we move away. We don't ever push the issue with them is something that we've kind of impressed upon the kids. We don't tell the kids, we tell the kids we hear things, but they don't know this story that I've told you.
But I'd be careful, though, man. You got to be real careful. It's not a game. These things, if it was grizzly bears out there, you wouldn't have your kids. I realize, and I guess I sound like a dick when I say that, but I mean, I would just be careful out there, man, because, if it was a grizzly bear you ran into, you probably wouldn't take your kids in that area just because, and these things, I'm pretty sure these things can kill a grizzly bear if they wanted to. But, in your situation, I think if they were going to hurt you guys, they would have. Even that last situation was a little dicey. That could have gone either way. But, I would just be real careful of taking your kids out there. I'd be real careful going out there by yourself or your brother or everyone else. You know what I mean? Because you don't know. You don't know what they're going to do. You don't know. They're so unpredictable, that you just don't know.
Yeah. And, my father, my uncle hunt with us. My brother's fiance, she hunts as well. And my brother and I are kind of the ones who we do all the work at the lease. We put up the stands, we put out the corn, food for the deer, and we do all the work. And we've adopted a rule that if someone's going hunting, you call and let somebody else know. Nobody goes by themselves. If you're going by yourself, you need to let somebody know. And the kids, as far as the kids go, the two boys, they're dying to go by themselves, and we forbid it. They're hunting with somebody, either grandpa or, uncle or me or their dad or, somebody's sitting with them at all times. They're never, they're never on their own in those woods.
That's good.
So,
yeah.
I understand what you're saying, and we've just, we started out as my dad's, hunting dogs, jumping rabbits and pheasants, tromping on brush piles from the age we were 6, and we're hunters, we love the outdoors, and it's hard to get away from it.
Yeah, I get it. I understand that. I would just be careful out there because, especially if she has little ones, out there, and generally the females, and again, this is my opinion, this isn't a bold statement, but generally speaking, the females seem to be less aggressive. They don't seem to be so quick to want to kill you. But having said that, there's two little ones that you heard, or you assumed it was 2 little ones, which means there's probably a male somewhere around on that property. Right.
And not to give away our location too much, but we are about 20-minute ride from Salt Fork State Park, which has its rich history of sightings. So, and as I assume 20 minutes through the woods for them is nothing. So I assume there's some more in the area. And like you said, we're very careful when we go in the woods.
Good, man. Yeah, no, that's good. And I, you've been growing up hunting, so I didn't mean to sound judgmental earlier.
No.
But what do you think Sasquatch is, Joe? What is your opinion? If someone were to ask, you got a really good look at this thing. If someone were to ask you, what would you say?
I thought a lot about this, and listening to your shows, I was, as I wrote my email to you, I was trying to think of my answer to this question. And, I'm not sure. I think it's an unknown primate that has somehow slipped through the cracks. As we've, developed over the years, and Gigantopithecus, over the years. From when I was a kid, there's been 2 major discoveries, as far as missing links go, in the world, and I believe this is one of those things that have developed over time that survived. And I think they've been around for as long as since humans were monkeys. I think they've just developed over time, and I believe it's along the lines of a primate. It may have interbred with a primate as Gigantopithecus, comes through the years, and it just kind of has gotten smaller and learned to adapt as its environment has shrunk around it. but I think it's just an unknown primate that has somehow managed to survive all these years.
Yeah, it could be. It could be. I hope you're right. You know, on that, when's the next time you guys are going out?
Actually, I was just in the woods 2 days ago for turkey season. Turkey season just started Monday in Ohio. You know, we go to the land quite often. Nothing happened. I haven't really checked anything. We keep up game cameras, but, you know, I've never caught anything on them. And we've seen, you know, everything that you know, deer, raccoons, squirrels, turkeys. You know, we have a black bear that some of the neighbors have sighted. We've caught pictures of that. You know, little bobcats. You know, we've caught everything on game cams, but nothing like that. But you know, it's every time out in the woods, especially turkey season. I'm more nervous in turkey season as it's more thicker. You know, you just can't see as much.
Yeah.
So I'm not real big into turkey hunting, but I was out the other day. Didn't hear or see anything weird. But yeah, we're at the land, you know, a couple times a month outside of hunting season.
Well, will you do me a favor? Will you keep me up to date and let me know if you guys go out there, you or your brother, and if anything else happens out there?
Absolutely. I will.
Yeah, and I appreciate you coming on, man. That was a terrifying account, really. I mean, because there's, you know, it's almost like a standoff. Who's going to make the first mistake, you know? And
right.
A bow ain't going to do nothing against these things. You know, they'll just laugh and keep coming.
Yep. And in the moment, you know, I didn't necessarily feel scared in the moment, but as soon as it ended, I realized that I was like shaking, and I realized how precarious of a situation I was in and how dangerous it could have, you know, become, and how, you know, as it was happening, I think I was just more awestruck, you know. But now that I'm not a believer, I'm a knower, I guess, to sound corny about it, you know, I've been more alert and more ready for things to happen. And I prepared my, you know, family the best that I could as well. So.
Yeah, well, be safe, and I appreciate you coming on and sharing it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And that's it for tonight, everyone. Remember, if you've had an encounter, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. Until next time, everyone.
About limitless infinite life. She is my thunder. No wonder I'm going under the intoxicating danger I like. Save me from myself, let me drown in my black lake. Let me float away. Save me from myself, let me drown in my black lake. Beauty is a black lake, let me sail away. Beauty is a black lake, let me sail away. an epiphany, bring the shore to light. Save me from myself, let me drown.